It's time for me to start.
Um, we will go off camera and then it will be time.
Yeah, gotcha.
Good evening and welcome to another Northshire Presents virtual event. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rachel Person, event director for Northshire Bookstore, with store locations in Saratoga Springs, New York, and Manchester Center, Vermont, here with my fabulous friend and colleague, Jess Hunsaker. Before we get started, a couple of very quick notes. First of all, thank you so much for your incredible support of independent bookselling. We could not do events like this one without the loyalty and support of customers like you. We wouldn't have made it through the last few years without the loyalty and support of customers like you. So thank you so much for that. Second of all, please use the Q&A box for any questions that you have this evening. You'll find that at the bottom of your screen. You can put questions there at any time throughout the evening, and we will save those up and ask them for you at the end. And then finally, if you're located anywhere near our Saratoga Springs, New York store, I think you might be interested to know that on Thursday evening, this week at 6 p.m., we'll be hosting an event in that store with author and historian Jack Kelly, who will discuss his book, God Save Benedict Arnold, with Steve Shanken. So please join us for that event later this week. I'm going to pass the microphone over to Jess, who will introduce our guest author this evening.
Cool. Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, I feel like this event with Jack Kelly is going to be really interesting. But without further ado, I am so pleased to introduce Bruce Dorsey to you this evening. He's going to join us to talk about his book, Murder in a Milltown, Sex, Faith, and the Crime That Captivated a Nation. He's a professor of history at Swarthmore College and the author of the award-winning Reforming Men and Women, Gender in the Antebellum City. So please just join me tonight in welcoming him.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Jess. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me this evening. I'm really happy to be here online with fellow book lovers and lovers of Northshire Bookstore. I've been a big fan of Northshire ever since I was first introduced to it while visiting my cousins who live outside of Manchester, Vermont, Dalen Cole and Julietta Cole. And Julietta briefly worked at Northshire as well. So I have my love for Northshire as well as for New England stories. And I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk to you about a remarkable episode that's central to the history of New England and the history of the United States in its earliest decades. The story told in my book, Murder in a Milltown, begins in a little corner of the country's littlest state, Rhode Island, almost 200 years ago. And I'd like to begin by reading an opening scene, the beginning of the first act of this story. So this is Act 1, Murder, Scene 1, The Haystack. Stepping out of his farmhouse, John Durfee noticed a chill had set in. The earth crackled under each step of his boots. It was the first day of winter, December 21st, 1832, a Friday. The previous day had been a seasonably pleasant autumn afternoon with clear skies and a new moon setting early in the evening. Overnight, the temperatures had dropped to nearly 20 degrees and a steady wind blew from the west. Durfee's farm lay along the main road in the sleepy village of Tiverton, Rhode Island, where Durfee and his neighbors made the most of farming small plots of coastal land. They toiled for generations, supplementing their modest income by fishing and by exchanging paid labor with one another. Tiverton sat a quarter-mile south of the Massachusetts state line. Across that line stood the bustling textile manufacturing town of Fall River. Durfee walked to the barn, hitched up his team of horses, and set off downhill toward the Taunton River. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. He got no farther than a few hundred yards when he saw a woman's body hanging from a fence post inside his haystack yard. Approaching the figure, uncertain if she were dead or alive, he parted the hair that had fallen in front of her face. One look must have sent a shiver through the farmer's already cold body. A rope stretched 6 inches from the woman's neck, securing her rigid form to the stake. No longer was it a typical winter morning. Glimpsing 2 men within view, he shouted out to them. Bear with me for a moment while I share my screen. This is a contemporary illustration of Durfee's farm, the haystack. And I'll continue with the reading. Within moments, Durfee's two neighbors arrived, along with his elderly father, Richard, who had heard his son's cry from the farmhouse door. The four men gazed at the woman for a moment, examining just how she was hanging. Then John Durfee climbed over the fence into the stackyard and tried to hoist her body so that he could slip the rope off the top of the pole. Unable to lift the body with one arm and slip the rope with the other, he heard his father's impatient holler, "Cut her down." Handed a knife, Durfee cut the rope near the top of the stake, laid the body on the ground. Then he ran to get the coroner. News spread quickly. Within minutes, a young constable from Fall River named Seth Darling arrived, along with a crowd of onlookers. Darling surveyed the grass surrounding the stackyard and observed, and others agreed, that there appeared to be no evidence of a struggle. No one in the small crowd knew the young woman. She must surely be, Darling thought, one of Fall River's, quote, factory girls, end quote, as women in the textile mills were commonly called. A young woman's violent death, no matter the cause, signaled trouble for a factory town. And so in the hours that followed, a local Methodist leader identified the deceased woman as Sarah Maria Cornell, not knowing that for most of her adult life, she'd gone by the name Maria. Then a doctor from Fall River also arrived, and he told the men assembled as a coroner's jury that the young woman had visited his office, suspecting that she might be pregnant, and she confided in him that she believed the father to be a Methodist preacher named Avery from nearby Bristol, Rhode Island, a married man with children. Uncertain whether the death had been by suicide, the men of the inquest jury, like all avid consumers of popular fiction in this era, felt they knew how to complete the tale that began with an unmarried pregnant woman seduced by a married man who was found hanging from the end of a rope. So they ruled the death a suicide, and the coroner gave permission to bury Cornell's body. So let me pick up where the story continues at that point in the same scene. It was still Saturday morning when Fall River's congregational minister recited a funeral prayer over Maria Cornell as she was buried in the Durfee family cemetery on their farm. As John Durfee helped lower the coffin into its grave, he remained unsettled by the previous day's events. After the burial, his wife Nancy prepared Cornell's personal effects to be sent to her family. Combing through the bandbox stowed under the bed, Nancy came upon the rumpled sheet of paper that John had seen the day before and saw that it was a note. It seems to have been written hastily, dated the day of the woman's death. It read, "If I am missing, inquire of Reverend Mr. Avery Bristol. He will know where I am. Signed, S.M. Cornell, December 20th. Suddenly, vague details in the unsigned letters remained less a mystery, and assumptions about suicide less convincing. Combined with Dr. Wilbur's story and the suspicions of the women who laid out the body, the note suggested more plainly that an act of violence had been committed by the Reverend Ephraim K. Avery of Bristol. Those few spare words, "if I am missing," suggest a tale that might easily have been buried along with Cornell's body. Over the next year and beyond, though, that note would incite countless stories told by countless storytellers, rippling outward from Fall River and New England to enter the national consciousness. From the moment a farmer discovered Maria Cornell's lifeless body, people turned to an assortment of labels to describe her. She was a Methodist, a crazy woman, a pious female, a prostitute, a wayward daughter. But most of all, she was a factory girl, which carried its own array of preconceptions. I'm going to show you as well that this was not the original document and note that happened, but one that was created as an act of popular culture and consumer item, a facsimile reproduced for people to buy and own in their own possession. And I can talk more about that in future times as well. So this is how this story begins. What I'd like to do this evening is share with you some of my thoughts about why this particular violent death became an irresistible topic of popular fascination in its own time, and what makes this a fascinating story for a researcher and writer and teacher like me in our own times. It was a nationwide scandal, but it was also a local upheaval for residents of Fall River and Tiverton, and in fact for towns all over New England. It was arguably the most important episode in the history of the state of Rhode Island, in the history of early American industrialization before the Civil War, and it was a pivotal event in the early history of the United States. Any violent death, particularly a murder, can rend the fabric of individuals' lives and disrupt a community, be that a family, a neighborhood, a town. But not every murder becomes something larger than the crime itself. Yet periodically, every once in a while, a crime takes on greater meaning and significance. Eventually, Americans would come to know this as a feature of their popular culture. Sensational criminal cases that get labeled the crime of the century, even if they seem to happen every decade or so. From Lizzie Borden to Leopold and Lowe to the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, all the way to O.J. Simpson at the end of the 20th century. The trial of the Reverend Ephraim K. Avery for the murder of Maria Cornell was the nation's first spectacular trial, and Americans at that time couldn't get enough of it. Before this trial could play itself out, it had become the longest criminal trial yet in the history of the United States. When most trials, even for capital crimes, typically lasted 1 or 2 days, this one lasted a full month, with over 250 witnesses sworn to testify. It took longer to pick a jury. It took longer for the attorneys on both sides to make their closing arguments than it usually took for a whole trial. And this case seemed to be about so many different matters. One of the reporters who attended Avery's trial and who published his transcript of the proceedings called this the most extraordinary of all extraordinary cases for all that it touched on. In his words, there was law for the lawyer, anatomy for the doctor, theology for the minister, knots and navigation for the sailor, and something for seemingly every occupation. A person, he wrote, could, quote, learn more about human nature by attending just 1 day of this trial than they could learn from reading books for a whole year. And for me as an historian, there was more about history in this episode than any historian might dream. Since spectators at the trial and audiences who read many accounts and transcripts, almost like they were virtually there, saw the changing society in which they lived unfolding before their very eyes. They saw in the saga's main characters, or in stories told by hundreds of witnesses, a glimpse of the life experiences of their own neighbors and their own families. They saw keenly that the issues that mattered in their changing lives were being played out in a legal thriller. And here are just some of the topics that this book is about in this case. It was about the beginning of women in the wage-earning workforce. It was about gender and masculinity. It was about sex and medicine and bodies, about abortion and sexually transmitted diseases. It was about celebrity clergymen and their all too frequent sex scandals. It was even about the invention of true crime and detective tales. And just as importantly, it was about conspiracy politics and fake news. And it was about something that we should be especially attuned to in our own historical time. It was about how does one do criminal justice in the midst of a popular democracy. When you read this book, you'll discover that I tried to make this history unfold like a play, since I tell readers early in the story that it was a social drama. a dramatic event that's happening in the midst of people. And a social drama, as social scientists tend to refer to it, is something in which an event expands to be something much larger with greater meaning behind it. And as a result of this, I divided the book into 3 acts and tried to pivot and position it as a drama itself. After all, it was not enough at that time merely to witness the trial live, and people did pack into the courtroom in Newport, Rhode Island, or to experience it vicariously on the written page, and more pages were written about this case than any others. But Americans also longed for the drama to unfold in popular culture as well. I'm going to share my screen once more. Just an example of some of the crimes of the century in this time period, from Leopold and Lowe and the Lindbergh baby to O.J. Simpson's case. But 2 long-running plays were written and performed about this case, one in Newport and a blockbuster one in New York City. And here are just announcements or the title page of some of these 2 plays, one titled The Factory Girl or The Fall River Tragedy, the other called Sarah Maria Cornell or The Fall River Murder. And popular songs were written, sold, and then performed repeatedly in Broadway revues for months on end. Here's an example of the songs and the illustrations that accompany them, lines in commemoration of the death of Sarah M. Cornell, or on the death of Sarah Maria Cornell, supposed to be murdered by Reverend Ephraim K. Avery. And in this one instance, the song The Factory Maid was composed by a blind poet named John Graham and had a weeks-long run in New York theaters, often at the audience's request. Theater goers would call out for the actors to sing this song, and then they would sing along with it when the chorus repeated, "Oh, weep for Maria, the poor factory maid, so charming, so fair, and so basely betrayed." And these popular plays bracket the beginning and ending of my book. In the book, you'll meet the characters in the play and the actors performing them, and even learn about the graphic art posters that were plastered all over New York City. Here's an example of one that accompanied the play's run. This was a lithograph produced by a famous New York illustrator who eventually faces his own trial in the middle of the 19th century as one of New York City's most notorious pornographers. But in this case, producing a poster that was put up outside the theater where the plays were taking place. But the case itself, especially the trial that unfolded, and Reverend Avery's trial, as I said, lasted for a full month in Newport, Rhode Island, played out like a drama itself, as witnesses took the stand, told tales they'd told in many different personal settings before the trial, and now retold them in a jam-packed courtroom in Newport to even effect. So this book is a glimpse into the world of storytelling. We can understand what this crime and what this scandal meant by unveiling the stories that Americans told about it, both inside and outside the courtroom. Tonight, I don't have enough time to tell you all the topics and stories that you'll encounter in the book, but I'll mention one. Murder in a Milltown is not only about the profound transformations that happen in the early 19th century in America, but it's also about the life experiences of the story's main characters. It's a deeply human tale about a young woman searching for independence. As I read moments ago, Maria Cornell's life ended in a haystack outside Fall River, Massachusetts. But her life began in the shadow of Haystack Mountain in Rupert, Vermont. about 14 miles or a 20-minute drive west of the Northshire Bookstore in Manchester, Vermont. What brought Maria's parents, James and Lucretia Cornell, to the southwest corner of Vermont, the New England frontier at the end of the 18th century? This is a story full of irony and pathos. Maria's mother, Lucretia, came from a privileged old Connecticut family. Lucretia's father, Christopher Leffingwell, was one of the first manufacturers in southern New England during the era of during and after the American Revolution. And as he was building his economic fortune, Christopher never dreamed that his daughter would marry a poor apprentice hat maker in his employ and move off to Vermont, only for James to abandon Lucretia and her 3 children, forcing them into a life of working for wages for their survival. So the wealthiest factory owner in Connecticut probably couldn't have imagined that his granddaughter would one day be the nation's most notorious factory girl. And in fact, when James began his abandonment of his family by selling his Rupert farm and moving to near Troy, New York, he moved closer, about 20 miles from Northshire's other Saratoga Springs location. So Maria Cornell lived and worked in a dozen different factory towns in 10 years before her death at age 30. And her story belies the myth that mill girls, likely those who went to work in Lowell, Massachusetts, just worked for a few years, saved money to marry, and returned back to a domestic life. Instead, other women like Maria, had to work to survive. And they chose to work because it offered them a life of independence and autonomy. Maria's story is a tale of a young woman who saw in the plentiful wages offered by mill work both an opportunity to fulfill her aspirations for independence, as well as recognizing it as an opportunity that put her in a vulnerable position as a woman alone. This quest took her to nearly all the major textile manufacturing towns in southern New England in these years. She worked in the mills that orbited Samuel Slater's founded industry that started in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and she eventually worked in Lowell, Massachusetts, America's premier industrial city, where she encountered the Reverend Avery. And I'll let readers discover that part of their story on their own. But Maria was also searching for some kind of family that would accept and welcome her in her life of travels. Though for her, this proved to be a faith community that thought of itself as a spiritual family, the Methodist Church, the fastest growing of the rising evangelical Protestant religions that were shaping American life in the early 19th century. And as I write in the book, Maria embraced Methodists as her surrogate family, clinging to them with a ferocity that only a neglected daughter could know. This new family eased the painful memories of a broken home, an absent father, an inattentive mother, a sister's rivalry, and harsh words of familial disapproval. The Methodists that Maria embraced were famous at that time for their popular but notorious gatherings for an entire week in a wooded setting, for day and night prayer and preaching and physical and emotional expressions of spiritual joy. These gatherings for a week at a time out in the woods were known as camp meetings. I'm going to show you an illustration of this. Here, just for a moment, is a Haystack Mountain, Vermont, a picture of Rupert, Vermont. But here's a contemporary illustration of camp meetings. The preacher on the preacher stand, and the people falling, fainting, shrieking, calling out, crying out for their Lord, experiencing conversion experiences, and the like. These were the Woodstocks of their day. People sensed at that time that camp meetings were a place where the emotional, spiritual, sexual, and individualistic characteristics, some would even say the excesses of evangelical religion, became manifest. It was what some people longed for and other people feared. And Maria Cornell genuinely loved camp meetings. She went to them on numerous occasions in her life. But it was at one of these camp meetings in the summer before her death as Maria revealed to a few trusted people, that she claimed that Ephraim Avery coerced her, perhaps as she described it, forced her into having sex, resulting in her pregnancy and the spiral of events that led to her death. Here's an illustration at the time of Avery, one of the frontispieces for the many different trial reports that were published at that time. The controversial image itself, the artist thought it was a genuine likeness. The Methodists thought it was a slanderous picture of a, as they said, describing a libidinous monster or a lecherous being. But camp meetings play a large part in this story. They show up in many places. They're the setting for the plays that I talked about. They get described repeatedly in the trial that takes place. And they also were a major part of a set of popular forms of writing that take place afterwards, including one of the first true crime books written about this case as well. And so this is the story, too, of how Maria was searching for love and for pleasure, for a family, for her own spiritual fulfillment, even if she had discovered, sadly, that the revolutions in the sexual choices for young women working in the mills made them especially vulnerable to the power of men and the surveillance and gossip of fellow women. As a result, this book speaks to a central question: who's to be believed in cases of sexual crimes and sexual violence? It's important to remind ourselves that there was a history that preceded the Me Too movement. And it's incredibly important to see how American culture and its legal systems have exploited victims of sexual crimes. At Avery's trial, the Methodists hired the nation's most famous trial attorney, Jeremiah Mason, and Avery's defense team turned the trial into an investigation of the moral character of Maria Cornell, effectively putting her on trial, arguing that her past illicit sexual conduct proved that she was more likely to commit suicide than to be murdered by a reputable clergyman. Maria Cornell, in other words, became one more example in a long history of courts redirecting the attention of a sex crime trial onto the sexual behavior and morality of the female victim, and making the character of the woman, not the actions of the man, the key to the verdict. To conclude, let me return back to the first act of my book, back to the final day of the life of Maria Cornell, and read a little from a scene that's entitled, "If I Am Missing." On the day that Maria penned that note that began, "If I Am Missing," she was boarding in the home of another factory girl named Lucy Hathaway and her widowed mother, Harriet Hathaway. And we'll pick up in Maria's last moments. Maria must have been nervous as she stepped out into the street after leaving Harriet Hathaway's home and pondered her future. Could she become a mother and yet remain an independent working woman? She knew she needed someone's help. She'd rehearsed in her mind how this might work, much as she had in a letter to her family a month before. "I still have hopes and fears," she told them, but she knew not what the results will be. Hopes and fears. On this night, Maria's last, it would have been easy for fears to loom larger. No moon rose and the temperature plummeted. Only two people worried about Maria that evening. Alone in their home, Lucy and Harriet Hathaway stayed up till after 10 o'clock, awaiting her return. Harriet had no one she could turn to for help, so she left the door unlocked and went to bed. "I felt very uneasy about her and slept little that night," she later recalled. Lucy's mind, too, had turned from hopes to fears. Excuse me. Lucy's mind, too, had turned from hopes to fears. She hoped that Maria had gone out with some of her Methodist friends that evening. But when she didn't come home, Lucy began to fear that she might have accidentally walked off a bridge into the night's darkness. Excuse me. When Lucy arrived at the mill the next morning, she asked the other girls what they knew. Right around that time, John Durfee was startled by the sight of a woman's body hanging from a fence post inside his haystack yard. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to answer questions from anyone joining us this evening. I hope you'll find this book to be a compelling story that puts important events at the center of U.S. history. And it's about America's first spectacular crime, yes, but it's about much, much more. So I look forward to talking to you about it. Thank you.
Fascinating. That's been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. Audience, any questions that you have, you can put into the chat box that you'll find at the bottom of your screens. And meanwhile, I have one that came to me from Angela asking, do you see any similarities between the obsession with this story at that time and the current day obsession with true crime podcasts?
I do see certain similarities between that. There's a way in which crimes especially, but even more so murders, tend to elicit a curiosity about them that exceeds their bounds. Part of the reason, of course, is that people don't tend to murder strangers. They tend to murder people they know, and with some rare exceptions. And the reason for that is because of some kind of social relationships that have gone awry. Lovers, and the trouble with that, workers who hate their bosses, a variety of reasons. I'm so sorry for a cough. I'm getting over a cold at this moment. But that's part of the reason for it. And I think another part that this story had was that it tended to result in more stories exponentially growing from it. In fact, this is the only known case I know of in which it's true that other murders were supposed to have occurred while because people had read the accounts and trial transcripts of this particular murder case. One case within a year or so happens in New Hampshire, where the accusation of this, two men in upstate New York, in Verona, New York, fight over the outcome of the verdict, one murdering the other over the cat. And I won't tell you what the verdict is. You can find out in that particular case. So that kind of excitement and obsession is certainly part of it. And then the ways in which people turn to every form of popular culture that they could look to. They were readers in that day, so they turned to books and reading. They were just becoming aware of popular entertainment in the broader sense that plays and theater were expanding, and soon to expand afterward would be the entire sort of genre of minstrelsy shows. This is happening right at that moment in time. So people turn to those things, and even the new tabloid newspapers come into being at exactly this moment. We're called the penny press in this moment in time. And Avery's, a story about Avery shows up in the first page of the first issue of the first penny press tabloid paper in the US. Yeah.
I have a question from George that actually I think kind of blends into that pretty nicely, which is, can you share more about the facsimile of Maria's note and how an object like that came to be?
Yeah. So there were 3 letters opened in her bandbox. A bandbox is the box you'd hold hats in, or bonnets, as they would have called it. And she kept in that box, she had some letters that she had received, and those letters are crucial to the trial itself. They are unsigned, they're anonymous letters, and they give clues that someone is making arrangements to meet Maria for some occasion in the weeks leading up to her death. And some clues even indicate that one of the meetings possibly would be in Bristol, Rhode Island, which was where the Reverend Avery was. And some names are indicated on that. So So people were really fascinated with these letters that she kept. They were known to be in 3 different colored stationery, a pink one, a yellow one, and a white letter. So they became famous for being that. And so a enterprising bookseller in Newport, after the trial was over, decided he'd make his own little booklet of those letters. And he went to the court record. He claims that he used tracing paper and traced over the content of those letters. And then he reproduced them in the colors that they were supposed to be, added some additional things. And he wanted to make sure he added this penciled, scribbled note. The trial transcripts, earliest newspaper stories indicate that that note existed and that it had it, but nobody had seen it until now you could have it. And in many ways, this is a little like the kinds of relics that people might keep and preserve over any important kind of historical event. So in the Civil War, people were collecting bullets or shells or anything else that they might. People from religious traditions would have some form of relic that might be connected to a martyred saint and so on. So people wanted some connection to it. In fact, they flocked to the gravesite at the Durfee farm just so they could have a glimpse of the gravesite of Maria Cornell. So she became a celebrity only in the end of her life. She became notorious as a factory woman more so after she died. But that's part of what it existed at. It was a consumer item to sell, but it was also kind of a relic of sorts.
Fascinating. Thank you. Eric wants to know, how did you come across this story and what drew you to wanting to write about it?
Yeah. I had discovered this story in graduate school, and a professor at Brown University asked me to start to organize and teach and create a course for college students all around this. And that's where I first came upon this particular sort of story. And then it's continued to fascinate me for many years. And I taught it as a course at Swarthmore College, where my students would read all of these trial transcripts, try to make sense of this debate over whether he was guilty or not guilty, and also over what they learned about this period. And then I realized that I was interested in telling this story. This is an unusual case, not in the dearth of source material, but the enormity of material that's about thousands of pages were written about this. But did that mean that we knew any more about it? Much of it was people's speculations, gossip, rumors about what they'd seen and not seen. So it's full of questions about how reliable are any of these of sources that we might look at.
Catherine would like to know, how historically accurate do you consider the plays to be, and are some of them more accurate than others?
Yeah, there's not much accuracy in them at all. In fact, the first one essentially believes that the story was in some ways a seduction tale, that there was some romance between Reverend Avery and Maria Cornell, and none of the evidence indicates this. If anything, the evidence was that there was a conflict between them, that he had excommunicated her from the Methodist Church for her sexual behavior, and then perhaps extorted or coerced her into having sex with the promise he'd destroy the records that she had confessed these crimes. So there's not much that indicates that this was some love lost, 2 lovers that fell in that way. But people turned to the storylines that they understood well. The second of those plays that took place in New York City at the Richmond Hill Theater, and the Richmond Hill Theater was originally the residence of Aaron Burr, the same place he returned to after he had his notorious duel with Alexander Hamilton. And then it was purchased and turned into a theater and moved to the center of Manhattan for that purpose. And that play is a rollicking tale of a group of lecherous ministers who were all interested primarily in their satisfying their sexual desires more so than their spiritual desires. To what degree that was true, that's an exaggeration of people who millions of whom believed deeply in the religious faith they embraced, even though many of them also cross the line between their spiritual passions and their physical sexual passions on occasion. So so there's not a lot of truth to them, but they're pretty fascinating reads, and perhaps visual scenes. I've never seen them performed.
This is totally just my own question, but have they been performed in our lifetimes?
They have in my lifetime, maybe not in yours, but at one time in Bristol, where there was the first hearing for this, there's a courthouse there, and on occasion, an anniversary of that courthouse, because it was part of that famous, they recreated some scenes of that play. And in fact, they didn't do the Newport one, they did the New York City one. And I don't think they did the entirety of it, but they reproduced some of the scenes. And he's I think he's called Averio instead of Avery in that case, but he's more interesting that he's called Reverend Wolfson in one of the plays, because he's a wolf in sheep's clothing kind of story. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. We are just about out of time, but we do have one last question that came in from Nick, wanting to know, was there anything that really surprised you over the course of your research for this book?
Yeah. One of the things that surprised me and was how few women came to the defense of Maria Cornell at that time period. It ended up being one woman in particular who wrote a book-length true crime story about this case. She was an author named Catherine Williams who lived in Providence. And she identified with Maria in many ways. She had been in a failed marriage. She had been divorced with a young child, and she took to writing to try to form an independent life. And she saw this story as the example of men who were almost all unreliable rakes who were as such. But very few women had the courage in that era to speak out for a woman who was thought to be sexually disreputable, who was found in a public place pregnant and murdered by and then perhaps might have tried to bring down a clergyman and all the rest of that. And that's quite different than what we would see in feminist movements, in the Me Too movement, and other occasions where it was women's voices who first came to say, we're the ones who hear and believe what's being said. In fact, it was primarily people who were critics of the Methodists, who were sympathetic to a certain view of conspiracy politics. They were anti-Masonic or Masonic, who tended to believe Maria's story, men more than women.
That is really interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bruce. This has been an absolutely fascinating evening. I've enjoyed it tremendously. I think our audience has too. So thank you for taking the time to talk to us tonight.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. And as I said, this is a story close to both Northshire locations, and that part of it I'm happy to talk about too. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Audience, thank you for being here with us tonight. You can order Murder in a Milltown at northshire.com or find it in either Northshire store location. And you can check out other great events that we have coming up soon, also at northshire.com. Thank you and have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.